Hey everyone, and welcome to the Mark Prater podcast, where our aim is to connect our global family of Sovereign Grace churches with our executive director. Mark, as you well know, and you actually set an example a wise pastor is a man who is a learner and a reader, always seeking to grow in our understanding of Scripture, and then ramifications, implications, entailments of all of that as we navigate through our culture and what's happening in our churches. And you certainly are a reader and have committed yourself to be a lifelong learner. And so, as we've done before, you have a couple of resources that you want to share with us. The first is a book by Dave Mathis.
Yep. Yep. It's a book entitled Humbled, subtitle Welcoming the Uncomfortable Work of God by David Mathis. A book I recently finished, and I'm actually taking my faith and work group through right now. I'm reading this book because I know that in my own life, pride is a lifelong battle, the sin of pride. And so
Mm,
I'm always looking for resources to help me grow in humility. I've benefited from, and many of you have benefited from, CJ's book on humility, just an
yeah.
excellent resource on humility. I've got some, that's a go-to book for me. I got a go-to section for me in Thomas Watson's book, A
Mm,
Godly Man's Picture. He's got a couple of quotes in there that always help me remind myself of my battle with pride. But I found this book really, really helpful by David Mathis. Some of you may be familiar with David. He wrote Habits of Grace, a wonderful
right.
book. One of the basic premises of this book is that humility and our growth in humility is not primarily at human initiative; it's at God's initiative.
Mm,
He loves us and he wants to see us grow in holiness and in particular
mm,
Christ-like humility. And it's just an interesting way to think about it. But he begins the book not only sort of making that statement, he then defines humility. And I wanted to read that. He said, humility acknowledges and obeys the one who is truly God. Humility entails a right view of self as created by and accountable to God. And this requires a right view of God as creator and as authoritative in relation to his creatures.
mm,
Humility is not then preoccupied with oneself and one's own lowliness, but first mindful and conscious of God and his highness. Humility becomes conscious of self only with respect to God. And that's a very similar definition that CJ uses in his book on
yeah.
humility. It is just your right understanding of who you are before God. I thought that was just a wonderful way to describe it. But he goes on to say this, and this is kind of the premise of the book in many ways. He said, humility is not fundamentally a human initiative, but a proper God given response in us to God Himself and His glory and His purposes in the world and in our lives. And then
Mm,
says this self humbling is, in essence, gladly receiving God's person, words, and acts when doing so is not easy or comfortable. And so we all have these events in our lives that are difficult, that don't make sense at times, that we really just don't fully understand what God's doing. But in those difficult sovereign events, I think one of the purposes that God has for us is He's just wanting to grow us in humility because He loves us that much. He
mm.
cares more about our holiness, as we've said before, you've heard before, than our happiness, and that is a loving God. Just one other quote or two more quotes. One before I give a specific one, but this is, I think, really well said. Humility is not our doing without God's initiative and
Mm,
empowering, and it's not something He acts exclusively to do for us, which we receive passively. So he talks about humility is really at God's initiative, but he makes a case for our response to that, and that
mm,
we're not passive, that we want to grow in humility, that we want to grow in godliness. And it's very much a Philippians 2 understanding of sanctification.
mm.
Work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So there's work that you have for God is at work in you.
Yes.
So there's that combination of our effort and God's initiative and grace at work in our lives. So it's kind of that he's capturing. And one other quote that really affected me. He has a whole chapter he devotes to prayer as an expression, obviously, of one who is being humbled and growing in
Mm.
humility. And he has this great sentence, and I'm going to read a little bit past this, but here's the sentence: humility in the worst of times grows out of habits of prayerful desperation in the best of times.
Mm.
And it just stopped. I read that sentence and it stopped me. I thought, in the best of times, do I have this prayerful desperation? And I
Mm.
don't know that I always do, but if I'm going to grow in humility, I must, so that in the worst of times, my humility is fostered. Is really what he's saying. He goes on to say this: for those of us who are under the delusion that we are strong, prayer makes little sense, especially as a pattern of life. But when we freshly realize our fragileness and weakness, we find that the New Testament's emphasis on unceasing prayer, 1 Thessalonians 5:17, is not a burden, but an unparalleled offer.
Mm.
Really well written. So just a few choice quotes that maybe might interest you, or what your taste for getting this book, Humbled. It's one that I would recommend and benefit from. Just another good resource on humility that you can have on your shelf and in your heart, and maybe help, if you're a pastor, just helping other folks with.
Thanks for that recommendation. I'm definitely going to grab that one. And certainly, one of our shaping virtues in Sovereign Grace is humility. And humility really is that cardinal virtue that is sort of the key that unlocks all manner of dependence and joy and godliness. And so, definitely a topic for us to be studying regularly. And I look forward to studying that book. One of the things that you mentioned from that book, not an idea new to David Mathis, but that humility begins with a right understanding of ourselves and a right understanding of God, of ourselves in light of who God is. And so to connect that, there was recently at the conference, you guys, the leadership team wanted to make sure it was on our radar, a book by John Mark Comer, Practicing the Way, I believe it's called, and some concerns that you have with that book. Now, I know you guys are not in the business of just naming names and taking down ministries. That's not what we're about. But this is a very popular book, very popular author on Amazon. I just looked it up this morning. In the top 5 books on discipleship that are being sold on Amazon right now. Also has another book, though, that came out, God Has a Name, back in October. And there's a resource that you want to recommend to help us think about this book as well, as we seek to care for the folks in our church that, at the rate these books are selling, we shouldn't be surprised if some of our folks are dipping in and checking out his books. So what is the resource that you want to recommend to us?
Yeah, I want to recommend this resource because, as you just said, I do wonder if we have more younger people reading Practicing the Way. And again, this is not red alert status or anything like
Yeah.
that, but it's especially for pastors, being aware of what your people are reading. And I just had a pastor last week in Sovereign Grace contact me, say, "Hey, you mentioned that book, Practicing the Way, at the conference. I just talked to someone who's reading the book. Can you help
Hmm.
me with some resources on that, how to reply?" Which I did. So just another reminder, maybe more people are reading it. It's actually an article that you sent me, Ben, that you found, and was grateful that you sent. A man by the name of Wyatt Graham has a more of a theological review of that book that you just mentioned, that Comer's written, and also he references a sermon Comer gave entitled "Why." And he gives a very thoughtful yet gracious critique. Ends by saying, because of Comer's view of God, he can't recommend Practicing the Way, because obviously his view of God affects, and you clearly see it in Practicing the Way, how he wrote that book. So the name of the article that you sent me, and I'm hoping that we can get this link into the transcript so that guys can just click on the link and reference it. But here's the title, in case we can't do that: how John Mark Comer's view of God shapes his spiritual formation. And
Hmm.
again, the author is Wyatt, Wyatt Graham. And it's a very thoughtful, just review of his view of God. And I think a couple of things just to point out. He certainly presents Comer, I think it's clear he is, as an open theist, for example, which will affect how you not only view God, but how you interpret all the events in your life and in the world. And he also, Comer seems to reject God's impassibility, sort of a
Hmm.
doctrine that has historically been held clearly, certainly by Reformed folks in in the theological world as a right view of God. And it's just a good article to read and be aware of because practicing the way is shaped by that by Comer's view of God. And
Hmm.
I don't know. What did you find helpful from the article? Anything you would add?
Not a lot I would add. I did find it helpful because I wasn't very familiar actually with Comer until the conference. I don't I'm reading a lot of old books most of the time, so I try to
Good for
keep
you.
up with new stuff that's coming out. But the issue at hand really is one that is so important for the folks in our church, like because what's being addressed here is where is God? One of the primary things, where is God in my suffering? Which is one of the most fundamental questions that people have struggled with, well, for time immemorial. And so for us, helping the folks in our church to understand, to see God as sovereign over all things and good is essential. I mean, we need our best theology when we're navigating through suffering. And so the concern is a book like that or teaching about God, which leans more towards an open theism view, for
Hmm.
instance, is going to leave folks that are influenced by that ill prepared
Hmm.
for suffering, because in suffering, that temptation to think hard thoughts about God and
Hmm.
begin to make false assumptions about God's faithfulness and goodness, those are all in play when we're talking about this perspective, false perspective, I believe, about God. And so I'm grateful for you guys pointing us um, to some resources and helping us think through like what folks in our church very well could be reading. And so we're
Right.
not policing that, but we want to be prepared to be able to serve the folks in our church that may potentially have questions about something as fundamental as uh, who God is in relation to evil and suffering.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing that I said at the conference, just a reminder that that sort of misunderstanding or false view of God or wrong understanding of God does affect what you see in the book. Riley Spring wrote a wonderful critique for me, and just saying the book, it basically it lacks gospel connections,
Hmm.
and that's important for us. First of all, as believers. Because I know my own heart, we can all have this tendency to try to smuggle our works into the
Hmm.
gospel, the true gospel. And as a pastor, we have to be mindful of helping people, help them not to do that. And so, a book on spiritual formation, it's a wonderful topic. We all want to grow and be more like Christ, but how we go
Yeah.
about that and remaining connected to the grace of God found in the gospel is vital,
Yes.
not only to our understanding and amazement of the gospel, but even of how we understand God Himself. So, just another thought in terms of just guys being aware of this potential resource being read in by folks in your church.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is that there can certainly be a temptation in our more reformed family of churches to believe God is sovereign, but bare sovereignty apart from God's goodness can lead one to despair.
Yeah.
Actually, it can be a terrifying thing to consider a sovereign God apart from His good, but His sovereign goodness, most visibly displayed in the gospel, is just essential, can never be divorced from the gospel, so that no matter what we're navigating through, what we're experiencing, the North Star that orients us toward the goodness and kindness and faithfulness of God, even in the face of the dark clouds of suffering, is the cross. And so, divorcing any theology that we have, any theological position we have, from the gospel or separating it in some way from the gospel is to our peril. So appreciate the thoughtful way that you guys in the leadership team think about this stuff and seek to serve us and form us who may not be as in the loop on some of the resources that are coming out. So thanks for the recommendations, Mark. We'll be checking out the that book, especially. I haven't gotten the David Mathis book, but I'm eager to order it. I'll be ordering it after I get off this podcast.
All right,
Uh,
great.
so thanks for thinking of us and for the recommendations. Thank you all for checking out the podcast. We'll see you here next week, Lord willing. Bye for now.
Thank you for watching. If you have questions or comments, Mark would love to hear from you. For more videos like this, hit subscribe on YouTube or by email at markkprater.com.